What does it feel like when the person the world adores becomes unbearable to the person inside? When success stops feeling like victory and starts feeling like suffocation? Freddie Mercury knew. December 1980, alone in his Kensington mansion, the world's most electric performer sat in complete darkness with a pen in his hand and a decision that would erase Queen from history. He was writing a resignation letter. Not a dramatic retirement announcement, not a temporary break. A quiet, permanent goodbye to the band, the music, the fame, everything. The letter was addressed to Brian, Roger, and John. Formal, final, apologetic, explaining that he couldn't be Freddie Mercury anymore, that the person they needed him to be had become impossible to maintain, that the God everyone worshipped was just a frightened boy who couldn't breathe under the weight of their expectations. His hand was shaking as he wrote the last paragraph, the one that would make it real, the one that would end everything. Then the phone rang. 3:15 a.m. Nobody calls at that hour unless someone is dying. Freddie almost didn't answer. Let it ring. Let whoever it was leave a message or call back or just disappear into the London fog that was swallowing the city outside his windows. But something made him pick up. Maybe curiosity. Maybe the universal human response to a ringing phone at 3 a.m. that says someone needs you urgently. On the other end was a nurse from a children's ward at a London hospital. Her voice was professional but strained. Beside her was a 12-year-old girl named Sarah who was dying. Hours left, maybe less. Her final wish wasn't for an autograph or a photograph or even to meet Freddie Mercury. She wanted to ask him one question about Bohemian Rhapsody, about the line, "Mama, I just killed a man," about whether the mom in the song ever forgives her son for what he's done. That question, asked by a dying child at 3:15 in the morning, broke something open in Freddie that the resignation letter couldn't close. This is the story of that night. What Freddie said to that child, what he realized about himself, and why, by morning, the resignation letter was gone and something else had taken its place, something that would define the rest of his life and change how we understand the man behind the legend. December 1980. Queen was at a complicated moment. They'd conquered the world, sold millions of records, played stadiums, become one of the biggest bands on the planet. Success by every measurable standard. But success has costs that don't show up in record sales or concert attendance. Costs measured in exhausted bodies, strained relationships, and the slow erosion of whoever you were before. Fame transformed you into someone else entirely. Freddie felt it acutely. The person the world called Freddie Mercury, the theatrical, confident, commanding presence on stage, had become increasingly difficult to maintain off stage. The gap between Farrokh Bulsara, the name he was born with, and Freddie Mercury, the persona he'd created, had widened into a chasm he wasn't sure he could bridge anymore. He'd spent the evening having dinner with an old teacher from his boarding school days in India. Someone who'd known Farrokh before Freddie existed, someone who could see through the performance to the person underneath. Over wine and conversation, the teacher had asked a simple question. Are you truly singing for them, or are you just screaming so you don't have to hear your own heart breaking? The question landed like a physical blow. Not because it was cruel it was asked with genuine concern, but because it was accurate. Devastatingly, undeniably accurate. Freddie had gone home thinking about that question. Couldn't stop thinking about it. It burrowed into his mind and nested there, growing more uncomfortable with every passing hour. By midnight, sitting alone in his mansion while London fog pressed against the windows, Freddie realized the teacher was right. He had been screaming, had been performing not to connect with audiences, but to avoid silence. Because in silence, he could hear his own thoughts, his own doubts, his own questions about who he actually was underneath the costumes and the stagecraft. The realization was crushing. He'd spent years building Freddie Mercury, years perfecting the persona, the performance, the public face, and now he understood that he'd built a beautiful prison. Success hadn't freed him. It had trapped him inside a character he couldn't stop playing. So he decided to stop, to quit, to walk away while he still had enough of himself left to walk away with. He found paper, Blue stationery with no letterhead. Nothing fancy, just paper and pen, and the decision to write words that would end everything he'd built. "Dear Brian, Roger, and John," he began. His hands shook as he wrote, not from uncertainty about the decision, but from the weight of what it meant. Queen without Freddie Mercury wasn't Queen. This letter wasn't just his resignation. It was the band's death certificate. He wrote about feeling like a fraud, about the exhaustion of maintaining a persona that had become more real to others than to himself, about the impossibility of being the god everyone needed while feeling increasingly human and breakable inside. He wrote about love for the music but inability to continue making it under these circumstances, about gratitude for the journey but certainty that the journey had reached its end, about respect for his bandmates but recognition that he was failing them by continuing when his heart wasn't in it anymore. The letter was eloquent, honest, final. He reached the last paragraph, the one that would make it official, the formal conclusion that would end Queen's story. His pen hovered over the paper. This was it. Once these words were written, signed, and delivered, everything changed. No taking it back. No second thoughts. Just done. Then the phone rang. The sound cut through the silence of the mansion like an alarm. Freddie looked at the clock. 3:15 a.m. Who the hell calls at 3:15 in the morning? His first instinct was to ignore it. He was in the middle of something important, something that required focus and finality. A phone call was an interruption he didn't need, but the ringing continued, insistent, demanding attention. Freddie put down his pen and picked up the receiver. "Hello? Mr. Mercury?" A woman's voice, professional but tired. "This is Nurse Williams from the children's ward at Royal London Hospital. I apologize for calling so late, but I have a patient here who, well, she doesn't have much time, and she has a question about one of your songs." Freddie's irritation at being interrupted dissolved into confusion. "I'm sorry, what?" "Her name is Sarah. She's 12. She's been a fan of Queen for years. We've been playing your albums for her to keep her calm, and she has a question about Bohemian Rhapsody that she says she needs answered before," the nurse's voice caught slightly, "before she can't ask anymore." The weight of this settled on Freddie immediately. A dying child, final hours, one question about his song. "Put her on," he said quietly. There was a rustling, whispered voices, then a small voice, weak but determined. "Mr. Mercury?" "I'm here, darling," Freddie said, and without thinking, he'd slid off his chair onto the floor, sitting on expensive carpet with his back against the wall. The resignation letter on the desk above him suddenly irrelevant. "I need to know about the mama in your song," Sarah said. "The one where you sing about killing a man. Does she forgive him? In your mind, when you wrote it, does she forgive her son for what he did?" The question hit Freddie harder than his teacher's earlier observation. Because this wasn't a philosophical inquiry. This was a dying child asking if forgiveness was possible, asking if the people we've hurt or disappointed can still love us, asking if we can be broken and still be worthy of grace. "Yes," Freddie said immediately, then stopped. Because yes wasn't enough. This child deserved more than a simple answer to a complicated question. "Tell me why you're asking," he said gently. "Because I disappointed my mom," Sarah said, her voice getting weaker. "Before I got sick, I was mean to her sometimes. Typical teenage stuff, you know? And now I don't have time to make it right. And I need to know if she can forgive me when I'm not there to ask for it." Freddie closed his eyes. This 12-year-old girl was dying worried that she'd been a normal, occasionally difficult child, worried that her mother couldn't forgive her for being human. "Sarah," he said, and his voice was different now. Not Freddie Mercury, the rock star, Farouk Bulsara, the person. "The mama in that song isn't just a person. She's every moment when someone loved you without needing a reason. Every time someone saw you at your worst and chose to stay. Every memory of warmth when the world was cold." He paused, gathering thoughts he'd never articulated before. "She's already forgiven you. She forgave you before you even did anything wrong, because that's what that kind of love does. It doesn't wait for apologies. It doesn't keep score. It just exists, like breathing, like gravity." "How do you know?" Sarah asked. "Because I've spent my whole life afraid of the same thing," Freddie admitted. afraid that the people who matter most can't forgive me for not being who they wanted me to be, for being broken and complicated and imperfect. And I'm just now starting to understand that forgiveness isn't something we earn. It's something we receive, often before we even know we need it. They talked for 2 hours about fear and forgiveness, about parents and children, about being disappointed in ourselves and worried we've disappointed others, about the difference between the person we show the world and the person we are in private. Sarah asked about Zanzibar, where Freddie was born, about his parents, about whether he ever felt like he was pretending to be someone else, about whether Freddie Mercury was real or just a costume. And Freddie, sitting on the floor of his mansion with a half-written resignation letter on the desk above him, answered with honesty he rarely showed anyone. Told her about Farouk and Freddie, about the boy from Zanzibar and the rock star from London, about feeling like neither and both simultaneously. Is it lonely? Sarah asked. Being famous but feeling like nobody knows who you actually are? Desperately lonely, Freddie admitted. Like being in a room full of people who are all looking at someone standing where you're standing, but none of them actually wow you. That's how I feel in the hospital, Sarah said. Everyone sees the sick girl. Nobody sees Sarah anymore. They understood each other completely. A rock star and a dying child, both invisible despite being constantly observed. At some point during the conversation, Nurse Williams took the phone back. Mr. Mercury, she's fallen asleep, peacefully, for the first time in days. Thank you. Is she? Freddie couldn't finish the question. Not yet, but soon. What you said helped her. More than you know. Freddie hung up the phone and sat on the floor a long time afterward. The resignation letter on the desk seemed to belong to a different person now. Someone who'd existed 3 hours ago but didn't anymore. He stood up eventually, looked at the letter, picked it up and read what he'd written. It was all true. He did feel like a fraud sometimes. He was exhausted. The gap between Farouk and Freddie did feel unbridgeable. Maintaining the persona was crushing him. But Sarah had asked if the mama could forgive, and in answering her, Freddie had realized something. His voice didn't belong to him. It belonged to the lonely, the dying, the people who needed to hear that forgiveness was possible, that being broken wasn't permanent, that love could exist without conditions. He couldn't quit because quitting would be taking something that wasn't his to take. Freddie tore up the resignation letter. Didn't throw it away, destroying it felt too significant, too final. Instead, he tucked the pieces into the velvet-lined bench of his grand piano, hidden but preserved, evidence of a night when everything almost ended. Then he sat at the piano and started composing. Not a Queen song, not something for albums or concerts, something private, a prayer maybe, or a promise. He worked until dawn. By the time morning light filtered through the London fog, he'd written something he would never share with anyone. A piece of music that existed only for him. A reminder of the night he almost walked away, and the child who showed him why he couldn't. When his assistant arrived that morning, Freddie was in the shower, looking in the mirror, putting on the Freddie Mercury face, preparing to be the god again. But something had shifted. The mask didn't feel quite as heavy, because now he understood it wasn't a prison. It was a tool, a way of reaching people who needed reaching, a method of saying things that Farouk couldn't say but Freddie could. Queen continued. Freddie stayed. The band made more music, played more shows, achieved more success. But Freddie never forgot that night, never forgot Sarah, never forgot the question about forgiveness that had answered his own unspoken questions about purpose and authenticity and whether any of this mattered. Years later, in his final illness, Freddie would think about that phone call often, about a 12-year-old girl who'd been worried about disappointing her mother, about how they'd found each other at 3:15 a.m. when both of them needed someone to understand their particular loneliness. After Freddie died in 1991, his staff cleared out Garden Lodge carefully, respectfully. They found things they expected: costumes, photographs, mementos from a legendary career. And they found things they didn't expect. In the piano bench, tucked into the velvet lining, torn pieces of blue stationery carefully preserved for over a decade. It took time to piece them together, to read the resignation letter that had almost ended Queen, to understand how close the world came to losing the music that would define a generation. But that wasn't all they found. There was another letter, complete, unripped, written on the same blue stationery but dated much later. Addressed to Farouk Bulsara, age 70. Freddie had written to his future self, the version of himself he knew he'd never live to become, telling that older man about the night of the phone call, about Sarah and forgiveness and understanding that voices belong to the people who need them. The letter ended with a promise. I won't quit, no matter how heavy the mask becomes, because somewhere right now, someone needs to know that Mama always forgives, and I'm the only one who can sing it loud enough for them to hear. That letter remains private, part of the Freddie Mercury estate, protected from public consumption. But people who've seen it say the same thing. It's the most honest thing Freddie ever wrote, the most Farouk, the most human. If that phone hadn't rung at 3:15 a.m. on a December night in 1980, Queen's story would have ended. The music that came after Under Pressure, The Show Must Go On, These Are the Days of Our Lives, would never have existed. All of it hinged on a dying child's question about forgiveness and a rock star's realization that his voice wasn't his to keep or discard. It belonged to everyone who needed to hear that broken people can still be beautiful. That forgiveness exists. That love doesn't require perfection. Sarah died 3 days after that phone call. Her mother was with her. Before she went, she told her mother about talking to Freddie Mercury, about asking if Mama could forgive, about hearing that forgiveness didn't need asking. Her mother said it was the most peaceful Sarah had been in months, that she'd let go of something heavy, that whatever Freddie had told her had given her permission to stop fighting and start resting. Freddie never told anyone about the call, never mentioned Sarah by name in interviews, never turned that night into publicity or narrative for his legend. But he kept the torn resignation letter in his piano bench for the rest of his life, a reminder of the night he almost disappeared and the voice that called him back.